Chapter 1 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in a public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ripley High School Army JROTC. Chapter 1. What took the Scouts up into Maine. There never was such great luck as this, fellows. You're right there, Step-Hand, and never will be again, that's sure. Let's see. First, there was a silly old epidemic breaking out in our town, and forcing directors to put up bars in the school till after Christmas holidays. That was a great and glorious snap for the Silver Fox Patrol of the Cranford Troop of Boy Scouts, wasn't it? But that was only the beginning. Giraffe, there were better things still headed our way. Sure there were, Davy. As luck would have it, just at the same time, Thad Brewster's guardian found that it was mighty necessary he get word to a gentleman by the name of James W. Carson. He wired up to Maine, you remember, only to learn that Mr. Carson, who was a great hunter, had started into the big game country after moose, with a couple of guides, and wouldn't be back until late in the winter. Everything just worked out for us. Seemed like, remarked the boy called Davy. Thad suggested that he be sent up to follow this party and deliver the message. And his guardian fell in with the idea right away, didn't he, Thad? I think he was only too willing, boys, because he knew we wanted to get up in Maine the worst kind, ever since our comrade Alan Hollister here began to tell us such splendid stories of the fun to be had in the pine woods of his home state. But go on, Step-Hen. Finish the story while you're about it. Why, of course, when Thad he found he could go, that gave him an idea, and sure enough, the whole of the patrol got the fever. Bob Quell had to give it up, because he had too much on hand to leave home just then. And Smithy had the hard luck to get a touch of the plague that had dropped in on Cranford for a visit. But didn't the rest of us hit it up, though? I should say we did, as sure as my name is Davy Jones. Well, the upshot of the whole matter was that one fine day 6 of us left Cranford, bound for Maine, with all of our camp stuff along. And here we are at last in the country of big game. Canoes, guides, tents, and everything along we need for a month of good times. Or more if we want it. But don't forget, Step-Hen, that the one main objective of the trip is to find Mr. James W. Carson, interrupted the boy named Thad, who seemed to be looked up to as the leader of the Scout Patrol, which office he really filled. Sure, replied Step-Hen, who was stretched out comfortably by a blazing fire, but we've got heaps of time for hunting besides, and trying out a lot of things we've been learning as Scouts. It was fine for our rich chum Bob Quell to insist on handing a big lump of coin to add to the funds contributed by our folks. That put us on easy street. And now here we are, as happy as clams at high tide, just finished our grub, and pitying the fellows left behind. Poor Smithy, poor Bob, exclaimed the one who had called himself Davy Jones. There were 6 of them in all, and it was easy to see from the various parts of the khaki uniforms that were in evidence these lads belonged to a section of the Boy Scouts organization. Cranford had made a start in getting a troop together, and the first patrol of 8 had been formed for some time. Another patrol was promised by spring, to be followed by others as the boys became attacked by the disease and desire to learn numerous splendid things that Boy Scouts find out. Besides the acting scoutmaster, Thad Brewster, and his assistant, Alan Hollister, there were Step-Hen Bingham, Conrad Stedman, who on account of his long neck went by the characteristic name of Giraffe, among his fellows Davy Jones, and last but far from least, a short, puffy, rosy-faced boy, Jasper Hawtree, but few people ever knew it, because he was called Bumpus by young and old alike. It was a little after the nooning hour. The boys had evidently been paddling part of the morning, for there were 3 long canoes close by, with as many men, doubtless guides, doing something to change the luggage so that it would allow for a more even keel during the voyage upstream. These boys would have liked nothing better than to have come out here by themselves, relying upon their knowledge of woodcraft to carry them through, for several of their number were well versed in such things. Their parents, however, would not hear of such a thing, and the expedition must have been wrecked on the rocks before it really started, only that the boys promised to take several guides along. And besides, Alan had informed them that by the new laws up in Maine, hunters were bound to employ regular licensed guides when going into the woods, to render the risk of fires less probable, since some city men are so careless about leaving a campfire burning when breaking up, and in consequence, whole districts have been burned over by the rising wind scattering the brands along the leaves and pine needles. But those 3 Maine guides were promised the easiest time of their lives, since there were so many willing recruits to do the cooking and lend a hand at the paddling. One canoe carried besides Thad and Step Hen a dark-faced, quiet fellow who was really a full-blooded Penobscot Indian and of course named Sabattis, as nearly all of them seemed to be. The second was given over to Allen and Davy Jones, with a young guide named Jim Hasty, who by the way was about as slow and deliberate as anyone could be. And the third boat had for a crew a real main character. Eli Crooks was about as straight as a pine tree, Giraffe, and Bumpus. Of course, the tents and various stores were divided up so that each canoe carried its share. Even so, they seemed overloaded at times. But then Bumpus was accustomed to declaring that the danger of their floundering grew less day by day, judging by the amount of edibles that disappeared after each meal. The fall season had set in so far that it was getting pretty cold in the northern woods, and the boys had come prepared for such severe weather as might be expected. But they were a hardy lot, and capable of standing almost any amount of fatigue. Already had the outdoor life of scouts wrought a remarkable change in several who had been hitherto inclined to be either lazy or indifferent to their muscular development. Bumpus Hawtree, fat little fellow that he was, could walk twice as far now as he could when he first joined the patrol, and besides, his general fund of knowledge had increased several hundredfold. Step Hen, once the most careless and indifferent of boys, was nowadays noticing the wonderful things that can be seen all around in nature's working, and thus he discovered that a fellow might have a fine time even though left alone in the woods for a whole day. Giraffe, too, had picked up amazingly. He never seemed to take on any more flesh, but his arms and limbs were getting like iron, and he, too, was beginning to take on a decided interest in affairs relating to the trail, the camp, and life in the open generally. Then as to Davy Jones, who had once been known as the Monkey, because of his indulging in all manner of acrobatic stunts, hanging by his toes from a high limb of a tree, standing on his head, walking on his hands, and turning back somersaults without the slightest warning, just as though he belonged to a circus. Even Davy was beginning to tone down somewhat, and his breaks were not quite as numerous. Of late, however, strange to say, Bumpus had manifested an odd fascination for imitating some of the tricks to which the acrobatic Davy was addicted. He had begun to even fancy that he was actually becoming supple, and could even copy Davy with ease. When these rivalries did not seem to be along a dangerous line, Thad wisely kept quiet, knowing that Bumpus would speedily realize his inability to compare with the active one, and besides, they often afforded a deal of amusement for the balance of the patrol. While the three guides were making sure that the last spark of their late campfire had been extinguished by pouring water from the river upon the ashes, the boys were taking their places in the boats. Davy was feeling particularly frisky, and resting his hands upon either gunwale of the canoe, close to the bow, where he had his position for the afternoon. He threw himself up with his heels in the air, cracking these together sharply. "How's that, fellows?" he demanded. "Don't you call that a pretty good poise? Why, I guess I could do it even if we were shooting the rapids. Hey, Bumpus, that's one on you, all right." And the heels cracked together suggestively. "Maybe you think I ain't got the nerve to try that cute little dodge," remarked the fat boy aggressively. "I've done a heap of things you thought I couldn't. Now you just wait and see your Dutch uncle show you a stunt worth two of that." "Careful, Bumpus, the water's deep right here," called out Thad, whose back happened to be turned toward the other canoe just then, as he was changing some of the stuff so to give his legs more room when he took the paddle. "And likewise cold," added Giraffe, who was grinning with anticipation of the fun that was coming. But Bumpus was in deadly earnest. He gripped the sides of the canoe, just as he had seen Davy do, and then giving a flirt into the air started to extend his dumpy lower limb upward. But alas, Bumpus did not know how to stop going once he got started. The consequences was that instead of remaining at the exact perpendicular, his body kept on turning until he could no longer maintain his desperate grip on the narrow gunwales of the canvas canoe. And as a shout broke out from several of the scouts, poor Bumpus went over the bow into the water, where he made a splash that must have dreadfully alarmed every speckled trout that had not yet taken up its winter quarters. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Cadet Lieutenant Colonel Spoon, Ripley High School Army, JROTC.
Chapter 2 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Nair. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 2. The Troubles of Bumpus. With a splash, the three guides looked up from their task at the fire, and then turned toward each other with grins. These boys were a lively lot, and kept things moving all the time, but already had the guides come to like them more than a little. But if one of the lads chose to go in swimming with his clothes on, of course it was none of their business, so they did not come to the rescue. "Whoa, give me a hand, somebody!" spluttered poor Bumpus, as his head came up, and he sent out a little Niagara of water that he had started to swallow in his excitement. Bumpus could swim, and there was not the least danger of his drowning, so none of the other boys manifested a frantic desire to help him. Indeed, Giraffe even showed himself heartless enough to give vent to a hearty laugh, while Davy Jones immediately called out, "Bumpus, you never said a truer word in your whole life. That was a stunt worth two of mine. When it comes to doing real things with a splash to 'em, well, I'm a back number compared with you. You Bumpus." Seeing that no one was going to do more than extend a paddle toward him, the indignant fat boy started to paddle ashore, where he crawled out of the water, looking like a half-drowned rat, as Step Hen took occasion to tell him. But as the fire was out, and the air rather chilly, although in the middle of a glorious fall day, wise Thad knew that the boys stood a chance of getting cold unless he quickly changed his clothes. "Here, Giraffe, overhaul his clothes bag and get out his extra duds," the scoutmaster remarked, in a tone of authority, which the elongated boy understood permitted of no nonsense. So he condescended to act as valet for the unfortunate Bumpus, selecting the garments he was to wear, and offering some of his own in case the other did not have a complete assortment. As Giraffe was as tall and skinny as Bumpus was fat and rotund, it would have been an utter impossibility for the latter to have worn anything belonging to his fellow voyager, even had he needed assistance. Fortunately, he had plenty for a complete change, and a sweater which Thad insisted he should draw on over the shirt gave promise of preventing any serious result from the ducking. "Wasted just 20 minutes, all on account of Bumpus's vaulting ambition," remarked Step Hen, when they were finally ready to make a fresh start. "Vaulting ambition is good," observed Davy Jones, with a wink at Allen, who sat near him in the second canoe. "Now, do you know, I've tried that stunt many a time, but I never yet was able to get one half the fun out of it that Bumpus did the first shot. No use talking, he can see me, and go one better. I'll have to take in my sign and retire from business, boys." "Anyway," grunted the object of all this side talk, and there was a twinkle in his eye as he looked at Davy, "I made the biggest splash you ever heard. All of you have just got to admit that." "You certainly did, Bumpus," said Thad. "But I'd advise you to be a little more careful after this, how you try to copy Davy Jones. To tell you the honest truth, though I don't want to hurt your feelings, Bumpus, but, you see, you're hardly built for doing most of the things he shows off in. If it was Giraffe here instead, he might have a look in." "But Giraffe, he's just a little too smart to get caught trying. He cut his eye teeth some time ago," remarked that individual. "But I give you all warning that from now on I'm going to try some of those different ways of making fires without using a single match. I've got a burning glass along. Then there's my fine flint and steel, like our forefathers owned in the good old pioneer days. And last but not least, I just bent on using a bow and a stick in the manner they say the South Sea Islanders do. You wait and see me show you something." Thad moved a little uneasily at hearing this. Truth to tell, he had had considerable trouble with the tall scout in times past on account of this very failing, which was once more coming to the surface. Giraffe seemed to be a regular fire worshipper. It was a subject that went way ahead of all others in his mind. Indeed, There were some of his mates who declared that the long-legged scout had really joined the patrol in order to find chances to indulge in his favorite pursuit, which was to see the flames creep upward, snapping and glowing. Giraffe, having started a blaze, would sit there and gaze into the heart of the fire, just as though he could discover the most wonderful things there. As a rule, he occupied much of his spare time when in camp whittling, and if asked what he was doing, would reply that possibly they might want to start a fresh fire later on and he was getting the tinder ready. His folks had had more or less trouble with him at home on this same account, as on 3 separate occasions the fire department had been called on a run to save the Stedham home when the boy, in pursuing his investigations, had endangered it. And now it seemed that his latest fad was to try every kind of known method for bringing about a flame without the use of a match. No wonder Thad felt uneasy. He knew about the stringent laws of Maine with regard to setting the woods afire, and with such a reckless lad loose among the pines, it would be necessary for someone to keep control over Giraffe pretty much all the time. The afternoon began to wane as they pushed on up the current of the river. The guides had informed the boys that there was still a short time when trout could be legally taken, as the fishing season overlapped the hunting term a week or two, and hence a couple of jointed rods had been brought along with the idea of making use of them. A platter of deliciously browned trout was a dish that appealed to the appetites of these boys tremendously, and right now Thad was keeping Allen on the lookout for a tempting spot where it seemed likely they might gather in a mess of the speckled beauties. All at once, Bumpus was seen to half rise from his seat in the bottom of the canoe in which he had a place. Thad noticed that the fat boy seemed strangely moved, as though distressed over something. "What ails you, Bumpus?" he asked. "I hope you don't feel the effect of your bath. This sun has been fairly warm, and by now you ought to be feeling all right, especially after doing your share of paddling for an hour or so." "'Tain't that," said Bumpus, weakly. "But I guess I ought to turn around and go back, fellers." "Sure," cried Step Hen. "Go right over the end of the canoe. The walking on the water is fine, Bumpus." But Thad saw that the other was really distressed about something that had suddenly come into his mind. "Why should you go back, Bumpus, when you know well enough it's out of the question?" he demanded. "Have you forgotten something? Thought we left all that to Step Hen here, who's forever losing his possessions." "That's right, I did forget, Thad," replied the other, with a forlorn look on his face that would have made the scoutmaster laugh, only that he realized Bumpus was suffering mentally. "Forget what, Bumpus?" asked Giraffe. "I'll tell you, fellers," continued the fat boy, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his heart. "Just before I started off on this glorious trip with you, my father handed me a letter, which he said he wanted me to take right away to Mr. Harriman, the cashier of the Cranford Bank, as it was very important that he should have it before noon that day. I was just trying to remember whether I did go there and give it to him or not, and, for the life of me, I just can't make sure of it." "That's funny," exclaimed Giraffe. "Ain't you able to recollect seeing the gentleman, or anything he said to you?" The other shook his head sadly. "That's the queer part of it," he declared. "Sometimes it comes to me that I must have done it, and I think I see it all plain before me. Then it gets mixed, and I'm not so sure. You see, here's what bothers me. That same morning, I met a friend who was going about 10 miles off in his dad's machine, and he asked me to have a spin with him. Just couldn't resist, boys, and we did go lickety-split, I'm telling you right now." "I saw you go past our house riding for fare," remarked Step Hen. "Tell us the rest, Bumpus. What had that ride in a car to do with the important letter your father gave you to be delivered at the bank?" asked Davy Jones. "A heap, I'm afraid," answered the other, making a wry face. "I can just remember that my coat managed to break loose and was flapping in the wind before I was able to grab it shut and button it again. And fellers, I had a glimpse of something white, like a letter, that had slipped out of my pocket and was carried over the fence into Brainerd's woods." "Whoa!" And again, "Whoa!" exclaimed Giraffe, that being his favorite way of expressing surprise and interest in anything. "I thought at the time that it must be only a scrap of waste paper I happened to be carrying in my pocket, but, fellers, it just broke in on me a little while back that it might have been that very important letter I was to give to Mr. Harriman at the bank." "Oh, the chances are 10 to 1 it wasn't, Bumpus," said Thad, who saw that the scout was really dreadfully worried, and in a fair way to have his whole vacation trip to the woods spoiled by over-anxiety. "Perhaps you're right, Thad, and it's kind of you to bolster up my hopes like you do, but then there is one chance, you see, that I lost that document, and I'm wondering right now what it could be. Oh, what if it was so important that my folks would suffer because I lost it? Think how I'd feel if I came home after having the time of my life up here and found all the household stuff out on the street, and the red flag of an auctioneer telling people that the Stedman place was for sale. Whew. It makes me feel chilly all over just to think of what I may have done. Then I just say to myself that, well, of course you delivered that letter, Bumpus Stedman. You couldn't be so wrapped up in getting ready for the start on this jaunt as to just forget all about it. And now, it's too late to go back. And I've just got to worry and worry until I lose pounds every day. And perhaps when we go back, I'll be a living skeleton like Giraffe here. Oh, that's the worst part of it. Better learn to quit calling me Bumpus, fellers, because right soon it won't fit at all." "Cheer up," said Thad, "and sooner or later you're sure to remember something that Mr. Harriman said or did when you handed him the letter." But poor Bumpus only shook his head sadly and sighed again. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Nair. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 3, A Strange Discovery. "How about this for a campsite, Thad?" asked Allen, half an hour later. "Looks fishy around here, for a fact," remarked Step Hen, just as if he knew all about such things, when, truth to tell, he had a lot to learn before he could call himself much of a woodsman. "Wonder if there's any chance of finding that bee tree you said you was going to show me sometime when we got up in Maine?" spoke up Bumpus, who had managed for the time being to put his troubles out of his mind, for Thad assured him that after sleeping over it, most likely he would remember some little incident connected with his entering the bank on that last morning in Cranford, and which would prove to his satisfaction that he must have delivered the letter there. "Well," said Allen, the Maine boy, "it's pretty late in the season to talk about bee trees, for I doubt if we'll find any of the little buzzers flying, and it's really necessary to have that happen in order to locate the hive, but I'm going to keep my eye open all the time, Bumpus, and try and accommodate you." "But just think of getting whole heaps of rich, ripe honey," ejaculated Giraffe, who dearly loved eating. "Say, wouldn't we have flapjacks every morning then, boys, with honey to smear over them an inch thick? Take me to that bee tree as soon as you locate it, Allen, and give me an axe. I promised to cut her down, remember that." "And I hope to hold you to that promise, Giraffe," returned the assistant patrol leader. "But what do you say, Thad? Shall we stop here?" "What do the guides say? How about it, Sebattis, Eli, Jim? Will we be apt to pick up a mess of trout here, do you think?" and Thad turned to the bronzed Maine men, who nodded their heads, and one after the other promised that if the boys knew how to handle their rods, there should be little difficulty in securing all they wanted, for a better pool could not be found along the river. A little side stream came into the main river with a noisy rush, falling from a ledge, and under the cascade there was a very deep place, where the trout were likely to stay until the coming of thick ice caused them to bury themselves in the mud, after the fashion of most fish, until the ice went out in the spring. Accordingly, a landing was made, and soon all was bustle, the boys working with the 3 guides, as became true scouts, eager to learn all the little wrinkles of life in the open. The tents were soon erected. There were just 2 of these, and as this was apt to make it rather crowded, the guides had offered to sleep outside except on any real stormy nights. They were hardened to the weather, and thought little of such a small matter. Of course, Giraffe looked after making the fireplace, for he would not hear of anybody else having anything to do with that part of the program, and Thad generally let the tall scout have his own way about this one matter. He fancied that it might keep Giraffe out of mischief, as well as employ his time, and save the guides considerable work. And Giraffe certainly did extract more pleasure in making a fine cooking fire than anyone Thad had ever seen. After supper was done, he usually insisted on having a rousing campfire, around which they could sit with hands clasped about their knees, or else lie in comfortable attitudes on their several blankets, while they coaxed the guides to tell them stories of the woods, and the big animals they had come in contact with during the years spent in serving hunting parties on the trail of deer and moose. Jim and Eli did about all the talking, for it was difficult to get Sabatis to say anything about his experiences, though everyone just knew the old Indian must be as full of thrilling yarns as an egg is of meat, as Step Hen put it. Thad and Allen meanwhile had taken their rods, and set to work trying to coax the shy trout to bite the bait they offered them. Both boys were good fishermen, and had had considerable experience in the ways of the speckled beauties, so that in the end they succeeded in getting a pretty mess of the trout, enough to give them a fine feast that evening. One of the guides was set to work cleaning the fish even before the boys stopped taking them in, and about the time the sun sank out of sight in the west, a most delicious odor began to arise, that Giraffe sniffed, with his eyes glistening, for this was the first mess of trout they had caught on this expedition. Later on the whole of them sat around the fire, and enjoyed one of the most tasty dishes ever placed before a hungry boy, fresh brook trout, rolled in cracker crumbs, and done to a turn in hot grease extracted from several pieces of salt pork. "Only hope we get a few more chances to feast on this thing before the season's up, or the cold drives the trout into winter quarters," remarked Giraffe, as he heaved a sigh of regret because the pan was now empty. For 8 hungry people, it was of course necessary to use both large skillets, and even then, the supply never exceeded the demand. "But why should we bother our heads about the season when we're away up here, and with no one to know what we're doing?" demanded Step Hen. "That's just it, Step Hen," replied Thad, who seemed to think the question was intended for him. "We're Boy Scouts, and when we joined the organization, every one of us subscribed to certain rules, 12 in number, you remember. Could you repeat those 12 cardinal principles of the Scouts for me right now, Step Hen?" The boy addressed turned a little red in the face, while the 2 main guides listened intently, evidently very much interested. Sabatis did not seem to pay the least attention to what was going on, though that may just have been his way. These Indian guides have a habit of hearing when nobody expects it. "Oh, sure I can," Step Hen made answer, cheerfully enough. "Then please, let us hear them," continued Thad. "Well," the scout went on to say, as if he easily knew the list by heart, "he promises to the best of his ability to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful to others, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient to his superiors, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent." All right, Step Hen, the Scoutmaster remarked. The great state of Maine trusts us. We've taken out licenses to shoot up here. We're entitled to a certain number of deer and 1 moose apiece, and in accepting these favors, we virtually agreed to refrain from breaking the laws. Can a scout be trustworthy who deliberately breaks a law, like the killing of game or the taking of fish out of season, when there's no real excuse for it? Well, perhaps you're right, Thad, grumbled the other, rather loath to see the point. But suppose now, I was lost in these here big pine woods and hungry, near to starving. I knew the season for trout was up, but it was a case of root, hog, or die with poor Step Hen. Would you blame me then if I just dropped a line to Mr. Trout and invited him to waltz into my little frying pan? Thad smiled. There may be cases where breaking the game law is justifiable, he remarked, and I'm not saying otherwise. I think that would be one of them. A fellow shouldn't be compelled to starve with game around him because certain men have decided that as a rule the laws ought to be made just so and so. But Step Hen, if he were really just to his better self, I believe that scout would, when he had reached a point of safety, go to a game warden, state the case, and offer to pay the fine if it had to be imposed. I rather guess the great state of Maine would do the generous thing and remit such a fine. Well, that lets Giraffe out, I see, remarked the still unconvinced Step Hen, because he's always at the starving point. All the same, boys, as true scouts, I hope none of you will bring discredit on the name of the Silver Fox Patrol by doing anything that is going to get us into trouble in case we happen to meet a game warden. For one, I'd like to look him in the eye and feel my conscience clear. And after that, Thad changed the subject, with the hope that the weak member might, when he had digested all that had been said, see the thing in its best light. There's one thing we don't want to forget, Thad remarked later on, as some of the boys began to manifest a desire for a little roughhouse time. What's that, Thad? Asked Allen, though doubtless he could already give a fair guess as to what the reply was going to be, since he had seen signs of a frown on the forehead of the scoutmaster when the noise broke out. We mustn't forget, said Thad, that right now we're on the border of the big game country, and any time we're apt to run across signs of deer and moose. Now, when hunters who know their business go into the wilderness, they don't pick up a row and make all sorts of a racket that would tell the timid woods folks a delegation of town people had invaded their haunts. If they did, they'd not be apt to find Mr. Moose within 20 miles. How about that, Allen? You're right, Thad, replied the Maine boy, smiling. Most of the deer hunters are what we call still hunters. They look for their game and creep up on it from the leeward side, with the wind coming from the deer. There is no dog chasing deer allowed in the state, or in New York any longer, so the noise and excitement is all gone. And in a noisy camp, you'll find mighty few deer taken. It's the quiet, earnest fellows who succeed in getting the game up here. You hear that, scouts, said Thad, pleasantly. We want game the worst kind, as well as to overtake that gentleman who is ahead of us, and whose trail we're now following. So, if you please, we'll dispense with the usual bugle blasts and the horseplay while in camp here. Let's have a jolly good time, which I believe is possible among boys without wrestling and singing and rough play. Am I right, Step Hen, Giraffe, Davy, Bumpus? You are every time, Thad, said Bumpus, and the other three were quick to take their cue, so that from this hour it seemed likely that the scouts, who were for the time being playing the part of big game hunters, meant to carry out the role to the letter. Jim looked at Eli, nodded his head, and winked. It was as though one guide had said to the other that Thad Brewster knew his business all right. About half an hour later, Step Hen was seen to be moving about in the bushes near the edge of the camp, with his head bent low. Now, everyone knew what such an attitude meant when it was Step Hen who assumed it. He had lost something, as usual. "What's gone this time, Step Hen?" asked Thad. "That little Jinx been around again, hooking your things?" demanded Giraffe, who always made all manner of fun of the careless scout whenever he complained that he was unable to find a certain thing, which he felt just sure he had laid aside only a minute before. As usual, Step Hen was simply positive that he could not have himself mislaid his property. Proven guilty on numerous previous occasions, did not seem to convince the boy that he could ever do such a silly thing again. This was always a case of where some mischievous chum had been playing a trick on him. "Why, it's that little bundle I fetched along, with a black piece of waterproof cloth around it, torn from an old raincoat," he explained, as he continued to poke among the bushes. "It's got some things in it that I thought I'd likely need up here, in case I happened to get lost. Among others, a cute little compass, an extra box of parlor matches that you just can't blow out in any wind, and some other little wrinkles." "Sounds all to the good, Step Hen," Thad went on to remark. "And I've no doubt that if you ever did have the misfortune to get lost while up here in Maine, that same little packet would come in mighty handy, providing you chanced to have it with you at the time. If it was in camp, why, it couldn't do you any good. But what makes you think it's gone now?" "I had it in my hand not 10 minutes ago, and laid it carefully aside," Step Hen went on, in a whining tone, as though he felt hurt, but which was doubtless only assumed for the purpose of arousing sympathy. "Oh, you can grin as much as you want, Giraffe and Davy, but it's so this time. I was careful as could be, and now she's gone. I just know one of you fellers scooped that packet and hid the same in the bushes just to give me a rough jolt, and that's why I'm hunting for it right now." Thad was on his feet at the time, and with a smile at the old complaint, which he had heard Step Hen make time without end, only to find himself compelled to eat his words, as Giraffe put it, he sauntered away, meaning to take a little look around before turning in. 2 minutes later, Step Hen gave a little gurgling cry. "Found it?" asked Giraffe, with an interested air. "Just like I said was the case," came from Step Hen in the bushes close by. "The feller that took it just gave it a flirt, and over she came right here." "What? Well, I declare, that's mighty funny now." And he pushed his way into view, carrying some object in his hand, at which he was staring incredulously. "Say, that ain't your packet, is it, Step Hen?" demanded Giraffe. "I should say it wasn't," replied the other scout. "But tell me, fellers, how in the wide world now do you suppose this came in them bushes?" And he held up what seemed to be a small handbag of black leather, apparently weighty, and very much used. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ripley High School, Army JROTC. The Ignorance of Step Hen. All of them, guides as well as scouts, stared at the strange object which Step Hen was holding up. "Looks like a little handbag of leather, but it's been used a heap, I reckon," suggested Davy Jones. "Just what she is," replied Step Hen, as he lowered the article, and something in his manner of doing this implied Giraffe to remark, "Reckon she must be kinder heavy, Step Hen." "Heft it for yourself and see," replied the other, as Giraffe came to his side. "Whew! I should say yes," declared the tall member of the patrol, as he lifted the old black handbag and held it out in a horizontal position for a few seconds. "All of 5 pounds there, if there's a single one. Now what d'ye suppose is in that thing?" "How did it ever come in them bushes? That's what gets me," queried Step Hen, staring at the bag, which he had taken again, as though half inclined to suspect that the mischievous little jinx, whom Giraffe always said played these mean tricks on him, might possess the power to change his black package into this weather-beaten little bag. "Oh, it's old, you can see," remarked Giraffe carelessly. "Perhaps the hunter that carried it up here got sick of his bargain, and slipping a few rocks inside to weigh it down, he just gave her a heave out of sight." "Think so?" remarked Step Hen. "Well, anyhow, it don't look a bit like that lost package of mine, does it?" "Suppose you open it up," suggested Allen. "It might be you'd find your missing things inside." Doubtless he only said this in a spirit of fun, in order to hasten Step Hen, but the other took it seriously. "Now, however, in the wide world would my packet come in here, Allen?" he asked. "None of the boys ever set eyes on this bag before. Have you, fellers?" Giraffe, Davy, and Bumpus therefore solemnly raised each one his right hand, and declared that to the best of their knowledge and belief they had never glimpsed that same bag until their comrade carried it out of the bushes. "Now open her up, Step Hen, and let's see the kind of rocks it's got inside," Giraffe demanded. Whereupon Step Hen proceeded to cautiously test the catch of the bag. Finding that it would give readily, he pressed it further, and then drew back the jaws of the leather receptacle. "Rocks!" he ejaculated, scornfully, just as if he had never taken the least stock in that far-fetched theory himself. "What'd you call that, fellers?" He had thrust in a hand, and was now holding something aloft. The dancing light from the campfire shone upon the object, which seemed to glisten like polished steel. Immediately Giraffe set up a laugh. "Well, I declare, fellers," he remarked, "some poor old carpenter's gone and lost this kit of tools. Shows that Step Hen ain't the only loony wanderin' about in these here pine woods, droppin' his things around loose and then forgettin' where he put 'em. And to think it should be the same sort of one that found these tools. Ain't that a queer case, though?" "Carpenter's tools," Step Hen went on indignantly, as he held up a second, and then other articles, which he took from the bag. "Did you ever watch a carpenter at work, Giraffe? And did you ever see him use tools like them? If you did, then believe me, that feller ought to a been in the lockup, that's what." "Lockup?" repeated Giraffe after him, and he stared at Step Hen as though he believed the other might be trying to play some sort of a joke. "That's right, in the lockup," the other scout went on firmly. "When I was down to New York with my dad last year, he had to see the police commissioner about a little business, and they were old friends, too. I went along and sat there in one of the offices nigh an hour. To amuse myself, I examined the heaps of queer things they had there, which I reckon had been taken from all sorts of crooks that had been arrested for years. And in the lot I saw some tools mighty like these, boys." "Wow, and again I say wow," murmured Giraffe. "Thieves' tools, hey?" grunted Bumpus, pushing forward to handle some of the shiny articles himself. "Perhaps now, one of these here might be what they call a jimmy, and another a centerbit. I've always used to read about such things in every story in the papers of a burglary down in the city." Davy also wanted to examine the things at close range, and so they were passed around. Even the two guides seemed to take a deep interest in the contents of the little old black bag, and for several minutes a buzz followed, as each voiced his opinion concerning the merits of the tools to accomplish such a job as breaking into a strong box of a bank. "But just stop and think," remarked Step Hen presently, "how far this is from any town where these fellers could use their tools. No wonder they hid 'em in the bushes right here. The only thing they could expect to break into up here would be the game laws." "Or the river," suggested Giraffe, with a sly glance toward Bumpus, who flashed him back a scornful look. "My opinion is, fellows," observed Allen, who thus far had not taken any part in the earnest discussion, "that these things might never have been lost at all." "Oh? Then you think they hid 'em here?" asked Step Hen. "Either that, or else just tossed them away, to get rid of carrying such a heavy package any longer," the Maine boy went on. "Such men would never come up here to camp out, or to hunt. Only one thing would be apt to tempt them to dive into the woods like this. They expected to be hunted, and are on the way to the Canada border as fast as they can pack." Somehow the idea seemed to please the rest of the scouts, and even Jim and Eli nodded their heads, as though they quite agreed with Alan, after he had evolved the suggestion, which likely enough would have never occurred to them. "Say, do you suppose now," Giraffe asked, "that these jailbirds could have cracked a crib before they took to the woods?" "Well, just as like as not," answered Alan, "though we can't tell that so easy. They must have tried to get away with some loot, though, and found the officers hot after them, so to escape being caught, they've taken to the woods." "But that might be jumping from the frying pan into the fire," Davy declared. "If they happen to be greenhorns now, it'd be apt to go hard with them up here. With the winter coming on, perhaps no blankets along, and only a little grub. They might even wish they'd let the officers catch 'em. 3 meals, such as they are in jail, are better than nothing to eat in the wilderness." "Oh?" Alan went on to say, "the chances are they had a feller along who knew more or less about what to do in the woods, and what not to do, because you see, they seemed to get up this far all right." "What if there was a big reward out for their capture, and we managed to crowd the bunch to the wall?" suggested Bumpus, enviously. "Say, we'd be fixed then for a lot more of outings, wouldn't we, fellers?" Alan laughed. It was so strange to hear Bumpus, usually the most peaceable of the entire patrol, speak in so fierce a tone. "You don't stop to mention what these desperate chaps would be doing all the time, Bumpus," he remarked dryly. "There must be 2 of them, perhaps more, and it stands to reason that they're hard cases, ready to fight at the drop of the hat. I guess we'll have to just attend to our own affairs, and let the sheriff look after these jailbirds." "But if we happened to run foul of them, wouldn't we be doing the right thing to try and grab the lot?" demanded Bumpus, loth to admit defeat when he had been conjuring up a bright idea. "Certainly, if it could be done without too much risk," replied the assistant schoolmaster readily enough. "Such men are outlaws to society, and it's the duty and privilege, I've heard my father say, of all honest persons to capture them, in case the chance comes along. We've got a rifle or a shotgun apiece, and each of the guides is provided with his gun too, so we ought to turn the trick easy enough," Bumpus continued. 8 determined men against 2 or perhaps 3, you see. They might be tough characters when they're in cities, but I just bet you now their old knees knocked together if they saw a row of 8 firearms all aiming at their heads. That's talking some." "I should say it was, from you, Bumpus," remarked Alan. "But don't get too anxious to come to close quarters with these men. I can give a guess what they're like. I've seen what they call yeggs before, roving burglars who play the part of tramps, so as to get a chance to look country banks over, and break in some dark night when the town people are sound asleep. And I want to tell you, boys, I don't like the breed. If I have my choice, I'm going to mind my own business and let the law officers attend to theirs." "And," broke in Davy Jones, "up here our business is first of all following the trail of Mr. Carson and his 2 guides, and after that to get just as much hunting of the big game as we can." "What you going to do with all these clever little tools, Step Hen?" asked Giraffe. "I hope now you don't expect to tote 'em along with you. If they turned out too heavy for the fleeing yeggmen to keep, think of how you'll suffer. Better give 'em a heave into the bushes again, and say good-bye. They might get you into a peck of trouble, boy." "Oh, I don't know," remarked Step Hen. "I'll keep the bag till morning, anyhow, and then let Thad say whether we want to pick out a few of these things just to remember the affair by." He laid the numerous tools in a heap beside him, and then turned the old handbag over, as though meaning to clean it out before replacing the contents. "Hello, what's this?" he exclaimed. "Oh, I thought at first it was another tool, but seems like it's only an old stick of dirty gray mud. Queer how that could 'a' got in this bag, ain't it? Whatever did them yeggmen want carrying hard mud around with them, I wonder?" He drew his hand back, evidently with the intention of throwing the article into the blaze, when a hand clutched his wrist, and the voice of Thad, a bit husky, sounded close to his ear. "Hold on! Don't you think of tossing that into the fire, Step Hen? Why, are you crazy? Didn't you ever see such a thing before in your life? No wonder Allen there was nearly scared to death when he saw what you meant to do, because, Step Hen, this stick of innocent mud, as you called it, is really dynamite." Step Hen weakly allowed his hand to open, and the Scoutmaster possessed himself of the deadly 4-inch stick of explosive. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Cadet Fallon. Ripley High School, Army, JROTC.
Chapter 5 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ripley High School, Army, JROTC. "Dynamite!" echoed Giraffe, as his face blanched. And the silly was just going to give it a heave into the fire. Great governor! What would have happened to the Silver Fox Patrol if he had? "Please don't mention it, Giraffe," said poor Step Hen weakly. "However was I to know what it was, when I hadn't ever seen such a thing before in all my life?" "Well," remarked Thad, grimly, "that's the time you should have remembered that a scout must always be prepared to think for himself, and observe too. I heard something of what was said as I stood here, watching. You had guessed easily enough that these were the tools with which bank burglars break into safes, and since you read the papers, Step Hen, you must surely know that they often use dynamite to burst open the lock of a safe. You never stopped to think that's trouble. All you had to do would be to say to yourself, 'Now what would thieves be likely to have this for, because it must enter into their business?' And the chances were 10 to 1 you'd have guessed it right away. Think twice after this, Step Hen, before you do a rash thing like that." The Scoutmaster spoke more sternly than was his wont when dealing with those who were under his charge, because he had been horrified and thrilled when he realized the terrible danger that hovered over them all, should Step Hen manage to give the innocent-looking stick a toss into the fire before he could leap alongside and stay his arm. Perhaps the dynamite might not have exploded before he could, with a frantic effort, dislodge it from the burning brands, but the chances of it going off were legion, and he could never afterwards think of the incident without a shudder. "I'll try and remember, Thad," said Step Hen meekly, for he was shivering now because of the narrow escape he and his chums had had. Thad, on his part, carefully placed the dangerous explosive in the crotch of a tree nearby, where it could do no harm. "We'd better bury it in the morning to get rid of it," he observed, as he sat down to examine the odd-looking assortment of little tools for himself. The others gathered around, curious to hear what Thad's opinion might be, for they were used to getting considerable store by his decisions on any subject. "How do you suppose now, Thad?" remarked Giraffe, to draw the other out. "These fellers just came to stop over here, and in the incidental place we chose for a camp? That's what's getting me." "Oh, that's easy," replied the other, with a little laugh. "We seemed to strike this place by accident, but I reckon that if you asked Ellie or Jim here about it, they'd be apt to tell you it's an old camping spot. How about it, men?" "Been here often with parties," replied the older guide promptly. "Seen hundreds of fine trout jerked out in that pool over there." "Me too," declared Jim, grinning broadly at finding how smart this boy seemed to be. "There you are, Giraffe," Thad went on to say, turning once more to the scout. "Perhaps, as someone said only a little while back, this leader of the sprinting yeggmen was himself been camping here. Why, there's a pretty good chance that Mr. Carson himself stopped here overnight, something like a week or less ago." "But he didn't find that bag, nor his guides, either," remarked Step Hen, with a little show of pride, as though he believed he ought to at least have a small amount of credit for bringing the thing to light. "For good reason," Thad went on, "because it wasn't in the bushes when Mr. Carson came along this way." "You think, then, that the fellers who own these things must have been here after Mr. Carson was, do you, Thad?" Davy Jones asked. "I've got a good notion that way," the Scoutmaster replied, "and we're going to prove it presently. There are lots of ways to do that, you'll find. And if Allen and I happen to fall down, why, we'll call on Sabatis here to show us. Allen tells me that an Indian can read signs just like you would print, Davy." "Like to see him try it, then," muttered the scout, casting a side glance towards the silent Penobscot brave, who was sitting there watching them, and never so much as opening his mouth or betraying any particular interest. though he must have heard every word that had been spoken thus far. After we've had a hack at it, we may, Thad admitted. You know, Allen is up to some of these things, and we ought to give him a show before calling in outside talent. Isn't that so, boys? Sure it is, cried Bumpus. And it's my private opinion, publicly expressed, that our comrade can deliver the goods, too. Give Allen a square deal, let him mosey around, and say what he thinks. Then we'll ask the guys to prove it. That's the ticket, fellers. And he can't begin any too soon to satisfy my bump of curiosity. They do say at my house I'm a regular old woman for wanting to know, and I must acknowledge the corn, all right. Won't you get busy, Allen, and relieve a suffering public? Thus appealed to, the Maine boy could not resist. Of course, I'm not saying I can tell you all that either of these guides might not to mention Sabatis here, he remarked, but I'll do the best I can. Reckon that's about nigh all anyone can do, observed Draft, also getting to his feet, for he was more or less interested in any demonstration of woodcraft that applied to Boy Scout knowledge. Of course, I know that what the footprint of every one of us looks like, even to our guides, began Allen, because I've made it my business to keep my eyes around. And the first thing I'm going to do is to find out if there is any track here different from ours. If I find that, I'll be pretty sure it was made by others who camped here within the last night or two. But why do you say that? Demanded Bumpus eagerly. What if Mr. Carson did stop here 5, 6, or even 7 nights ago? You might run on his track, you know. If I did, I'd know it, replied Allen. Not that I've even set eyes on the print of his hunting shoe or boot, if he wears such, instead of moccasins. But stop and remember, Bumpus, we had a heavy rain day before yesterday that must have passed over this section as well as where we struck it. After that, it turned cold. Oh, I forgot all about that, admitted the other scout, looking foolish. Why, of course, that same rain would have washed out the footprints of anybody who had camped here as long as 4 or 5 nights ago. That's right, Allen. If it didn't exactly wash the footprints out, it would make them look faint, and the trailer would soon know they were old. Now let me take a turn around and do the rest of you sit quiet here till I call out that I've found something. He took a blazing brand from the fire and began to move around the outskirts of the camp, beyond the tents and the glow of the fire. Why does he go so far away? Asked Bumpus. Because we've been walking around here so much that all chances of making any discovery would be lost, replied Thad. And out there he may stand and show. There I can see him stoop lower down, and I wouldn't be surprised if he'd hit a footprint right away. The others all craned their necks in order to see what Allen was doing, and of course Giraffe had them left far in the lurch when it came to this, on account of his being gifted by a bountiful nature with such an exceedingly long ostrich-like appendage below his head. Yes, he sure struck something, Giraffe declared, as though anxious to show what an advantage it was sometimes to be the professor of a neck that was longer than any of the others. There, he's beckoning to us to come on over, fellers, exclaimed Bumpus, as he tried to leap to his feet, but owing to his weight, this was never an easy thing for him, and he did not refuse the helping hand Thad stretched out. So they joined Allen as he stood there holding his torch near the ground. What you found? Asked Giraffe as they came up. Here's a print, all right, that seems altogether different from any of ours. I can show you that the shoe has been patched across the toe, and none of ours have such a mark. It's a fresh print, too, and that means the man who made it must have been here since that rainstorm. Is that clear enough for you boys? It's a cinch, that's what, Allen. Why, I'm only a tenderfoot scout, but I can understand that much, and I'm real glad to know it, too. We want to take a good look at that shoe print, fellers. Perhaps we might want to know it again sometime. Step Hen, as he said this, threw himself down on the ground and seemed to be making a mental photograph of the impression. How do you reckon they got here, Allen? By boat or through the woods, direct? Asked Thad, as though he had himself been pondering over that question without being able to connect as yet. Let's take a look along the edge of the river, remarked the Maine boy. If so be they had a canoe, we ought to be able to see where it was pulled up on the little beach down there. Such a mark would stay a long time unless the water rose, and I don't think that happened here. Not over half a foot, anyhow. So once more they walked after Allen, who was soon examining the shore up close to the edge of the water. There's a mark you can all see that looks as if a boat had been pulled up, but it's old and faint. The rain has nearly washed it out. Do any of you glimpse signs of another scratch that's fresher? Allen's purpose, of course, was to make his chums think they were having a hand in the search. Then, when telling the story afterwards, they could say, when we had hunted all along the shore, we didn't find any fresh sign. We knew that the yeggs must sure have walked all the way through the woods. There was a little hustle as Giraffe, Davy, Step Hen, and Bumpus all endeavored to earn the right to include themselves in the affair, after which they united in declaring that no further signs lay along the little beach. "Well, we've settled that part of it pretty cleverly, I guess," Thad declared as he smiled at Allen. "It was one of the easiest jobs I've ever tackled," declared the other. "Wonder which way they went when they left here," Bumpus remarked. "Now just don't bother your head about that, Bumpus," said Step Hen. "You're letting your envious mind think of the fat reward again, but you better forget it, Thad says." "Oh, if they were making toward the Canada border," observed Allen, "why, of course, they headed north after leaving here." "And so are we," was all Bumpus allowed himself to say in reply, but the look he gave Step Hen was sufficient to announce that he did not mean to wholly relinquish all idea that somehow, sometime, they might yet run across the fugitives, and be able to capture them handsomely. The boys started back toward the fire. Some of them were even settled down close to the cheerful blaze, warming themselves and ready to talk some more about the strange thing that had happened. Bumpus was kicking his toe in the earth as if some object had attracted his attention. All at once he swooped down and then gave an utterance to an excited ejaculation. "Looky what I got, fellers!" he exclaimed, hurrying up to the fire. "Money, real hard money," cried Step Hen enviously. "Where'd you dig that up, Bumpus? Say, perhaps there's more like it buried there. Maybe we'll all strike a gold mine and go home millionaires, every one." For Bumpus was holding a bright new $5 gold piece in his hand, at which they all stared with more or less delight. I saw it shining and gave a little click at its place, thinking it might be a piece of glass or some old tin can cut off a can. Then it broke loose from the frozen dirt, and I saw this little beauty, Bumpus was saying in rapture. "Easy money," grunted Giraffe enviously, while Step Hen darted over to see if he might not be as lucky, though only to meet with bitter disappointment. "That seems to settle one thing, boys," remarked Thad. "Those rascals did rob a bank before they took to the woods, and the stuff they got was so heavy to carry they just had to throw away their tools here. That looks plain enough, don't it?" All of them agreed that it did sound very much that way. Indeed, Davy Jones remarked that he considered them very sensible men, because he himself would only carry too gladly to get rid of some old steel tools if he had a chance to carry a bag of gold coins along. 10 minutes later, as they were talking and laughing there, never thinking how late the hour was getting and that they ought to be sinking their blankets under the shelter of the two tents, Sabattis was seen to quietly reach out his hand and pick up his gun, after which he slipped away. The boys exchanged glances, but made no remark. Another 10 minutes passed by, when there came a startling interruption to the peace quiet of the camp. From some point nearby a harsh voice suddenly sounded, thrilling the scouts as they seldom remembered being shaken. "Throw up your hands there, every one of you, and see that you keep them raised, and if you know what's good for you." And at the same moment 3 men issued from the recesses of the woods and advanced toward them, all of whom held level guns in their hands. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Cadet Medford, Ripley High School, Army JROTC.
Chapter 6 of The Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ripley High School, Army JROTC. A sheriff's posse. Of course, everybody did as they were told, and when they afterwards exchanged opinions regarding the ridiculous character of the picture they must have made, with 6 boys and 2 men trying to see who could elevate his hands the highest, they must always laugh until the tears rolled down their cheeks. Somehow, all of the scouts just took it for granted that these 3 advancing parties must surely be the men of whom they had been talking, the fleeing, desperate rascals who had lately robbed a bank, and were trying to make the border so that they might cross over into Canada, from which territory they would be able to make faces at any pursuers. But Thad, as he began to see the newcomers better when they drew nearer the fire, felt relieved. An idea started to flit through his active brain, to the effect that after all they might not be the thieves, come back for some purpose, perhaps to recover possession of the little old black tool bag. "Now," called out the tall man, who was in the lead, and who seemed to be in authority, "we know you're tough cases, and we don't mean to give any one of you a chance to play a game on us. So my men will keep you all covered while I go to the rounds and put the irons in." "Wow!" exclaimed Giraffe. His eyes looked as round as saucers when he heard this remark on the part of the supposed terrible yeggman. "Please go a little slow about that, Mr. Sheriff," called out Thad. "If you look again, I'm sure you'll discover that 6 of us are only boys, and that we belong to a troop of scouts. We're up here on the track of a Mr. James W. Carson, who is in the woods with 2 guides. It is of great importance that I find him, as I am bearing a communication that means a heap to both Mr. Carson and my guardian. As for these 2 men here, they are our guides, Jim Hasty and Eli Crooks. And I guess you ought to know them both, sir. And there's another, Sabatis, who's right behind you, gun in hand, ready to hold you up if you try to do us any harm." The tall man who Thad had rightly guessed to be the sheriff and chase after the burglars, who were fleeing toward the border, gave another look, and then burst into a loud shout. "That's one on us, all right, young fellow," he remarked. "We wondered why under the sun our birds had started to hobnob with a crowd of Boy Scouts. But you never can tell what's what when you're dealing with such sharp customers, and we didn't mean to take any chances. It's all right, men. You needn't handle those guns as if you meant to shoot any longer. These parties are all right, but what I do want to know is how you came by that." He pointed as he spoke at the old tool bag that was lying behind Step Hen, and evidently he must have recognized it, or else suspected what it contained. "That's mine. I meant to say, I found the same in the bushes here when I was hunting something I lost." And Step Hen held up a little packet secured in waterproof cloth, which he had evidently since discovered just where he formerly laid it down. "We opened the bag, and guess what the tools must have been thrown away by some yeggmen who were making a bolt across country for the Canada border," remarked Thad, as the 3 officers sat down close to the fire to warm their hands. "And that's just what's what," responded the sheriff, nodding as he examined the contents of the bag. "We hope to get 'em in time, because it means a cool 1,000 to us, perhaps more, because the reward may have been doubled after we hit the woods. Sometimes we've been hot on the track, and then again they'd give us the slip, and we'd lose ground. I've often wished we had dogs along, but they're hard to find, and people, somehow, don't like to see dogs up here, since the law put a ban on deer hounding. I'd like to keep just one of them tools to remember my find by, if you didn't have any objection," suggested Step Hen anxiously. "You can keep the whole bunch if you like, son," answered the sheriff. "We don't need any such evidence against these birds, if only we can catch 'em. They're carrying all the evidence we want in the shape of the entire capital of the bank they looted so slick." "I suppose they broke open the safe in the usual way, with dynamite?" Thad remarked quietly. "Just what they did, though how you guessed it, I don't see," the sheriff replied. "We found something in the bag that told us that," and Thad, as he spoke, stepped over to the tree, in the crotch of which he had placed the stick of dynamite. Step Hen turned red in the face as he heard the story told of how he had just been about to throw the unknown substance into the fire when prevented. The lengthy sheriff looked reproachfully toward him, and remarked mildly, "You want to go slow, my boy, about handling things that you never saw before. I wouldn't like to say what would have happened to the lot of you, once it's dropped into that red-hot fire. Many a fool miner has been blown to atoms because he tried to dry damp dynamite out in an oven, and let it get too hot. Better ask yourself a few questions before you go to trying tricks with strange things." "Will you spend the night with us, Mr. Sheriff?" asked Thad, thinking they ought to appear hospitable, as everyone who goes into the great timber should be. Besides, he rather fancied this Maine sheriff, and believed that a session in his company alongside the blazing campfire would be both pleasant and profitable, as doubtless the officer could relate many things of interest to the scouts. But the other shook his head. "Sorry, but when we're as close to the heels of our game as this, we must keep on the move. It requires considerable hustling to run down such a lively set as those 3 yeggs. And Charlie Barnes, he knows his business up here in the woods all right. They've led us a lively chase up to now, but the longer we're held off, the more determined we become to follow them, night and day, till we bring the lot to bay. They've got mighty little grub along, and we don't want to let 'em have any time to hunt. Then perhaps hunger will help us out." "But if you're going on right away," said Allen, Perhaps you'd let us make you some hot coffee, Mr. Green?" The sheriff looked keenly at him, and then held out a hand. "Seemed like that was something kinder familiar about your make-up," he said. "Now I know you, Alan Hollister. How's the dad, and the little lady you call mother? I remember her well, and you too, as a boy who loved to hunt and fish as well as any lad in all Penobscot County." "My father is dead, Mr. Green, but mother is fairly well," replied the boy with a sad tone in his voice. "We are not living in Maine any longer, but down in New York State, where all these other scouts belong. But will you drink that coffee, if we make a pot for you?" The sheriff saw that Allen did not seem inclined to say anything more about his own family, and so he allowed the subject to drop. But he did look inquiringly at his two husky deputies, who gave him affirmative as well as eager nods. "Just please yourselves, young fellows," he remarked. "My men look a bit piqued, because we've been hitting it up at quite a warm pace, and I guess now they'd enjoy a hot cup right smart. I confess I wouldn't object myself, seeing that you're so pressing." The coffee pot was quickly clapped on the red coals, and would soon be sending out a fragrant odor. Thad, meanwhile, stayed to converse with the officer, and by asking a few questions learned something concerning the robbery, of which the three fleeing tramp burglars had been guilty. According to the sheriff, they were all hard characters, and had served time in various jails for other crimes. "If by chance you did run across the lot," he observed, "you'd better look sharp, for they wouldn't hesitate at anything if they thought there was any fear of being held up. Remember that, boys, and govern yourselves accordingly." "Which, I take it," observed the listening Bumpus, "to mean that we had ought to get them covered first if we run up against the crowd." "Just what it does, and look out for tricks. That Charlie, he's as full of sly games as an egg is of meat. That does smell prime, son. What, condensed milk along with you too, and sugar. I must say we struck a snap when we saw your fire here, after heading for this old campground. That tastes like nectar, let me tell you, and warms a fellow up inside better than any strong drink ever could." "Glad you like it," said Thad, "and we all of us hope you come up with those three tramp burglars, and gather them in." After drinking several cups of the coffee apiece, the sheriff and his posse of two deputies declared that they ought to be going. "We've got a pretty good hunch as to where they struck for after leaving here," remarked the officer as he shook hands all around, not forgetting the silent Indian guide. "And if they only stop over a day, so's to get some game, why, we expect to surprise them right smart. Goodbye, boys, and good luck. If so be we run across Mr. Carson, whom I happen to know, why, we'll tell him you're on his trail." Waving his hand to them, the sheriff walked quickly away, followed by his two men, and they were heading due north the last the scouts saw of them. "Wonder if they'll overtake that active bunch, or will the yeggs get across the line as they're planning to do?" Giraffe ventured, as they sat there talking over this latest development in the affair, though one or two of the scouts began to yawn every minute or so, and rub their eyes as though growing sleepy. "Nobody can tell," Thad remarked, "but that Sheriff Green bears all the earmarks of an officer who generally get what he goes after." "That's what they say about him," Allen put in, for he had not been talking with the rest, something which the sheriff had said, possibly when asking after his father, had caused the boy to think of things that had happened in the past, which apparently could not be apt to give him joy. By degrees, the scouts sought their blankets under the canvas. Thad and Allen were the last to crawl in. The guides had made themselves comfortable near the fire, having blankets with them, and the boys noticed how they all made sure to keep their feet toward the blaze when selecting places for the night. It was the woodsman's way, because the feet are the first part of the body to feel cold when, during sleep, the blood fails to circulate as thoroughly as when one is awake, since the heart slackens its function in order to get rested for the next day's labor. Finally, all was quiet. The night wind crooned among the trees, an owl hooted to its mate, but the scouts all slept calmly, with not a fear of danger. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Cadet Spinks, Ripley High School, Army JRTC.
Chapter 7 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Monty Spanero. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 7. The Birch Bark Challenge. Ellie says we're now in big game country, fellows. Giraffe was rubbing at his gun when he made this remark. They sat about a fire among the pines that bordered the river, and another day had elapsed since we last saw them in camp, at the time of the visit made by the Maine sheriff and his posse. "That sounds good to me," Step Hen observed. "Now, as for myself, I never claimed to be a great shake at doing any hunting, but all the same, I feel a longing to see a great moose standing up before me while I proceed to bore him through and through with my trusty rifle." Giraffe laughed scornfully as he continued to rub away with his rag he had greased with Vaseline. "You just take it from me, son, though I'm not a great woodsman myself, that if you ever do shoot that pop gun of yours at a full-grown moose, the quicker you shin up a good tree, the better, for if you delay, he's going to help you with his horns." "Pop gun nothin'," remonstrated Step Hen. "Now, I'd just like to know what you mean by that. I took advice before I had my dad buy me that gun. It was Allen here who told me the good points about it. Just because you carry one of those old-fashioned big-bore rifles that carry half a pound of lead, more or less, you think a light 30-30 gun is a plaything. But, my friend, investigate, and you'll discover that it all lies in the ammunition you use, not the bore of the gun. Ain't that a fact, Thad?" "It certainly is," replied the other, "and I'll prove it when I borrow that new repeating rifle of yours, Step Hen, to try and bring down my own moose when I get a chance to strike one." "Huh? Don't see how you made that out," grumbled Giraffe. "This here gun is one of the hardest hitters ever made. It is some hefty, I admit, and in a long jaunt you'd come off much better than me, Step Hen. But what harm could your little pea shooter do against a big black bear, or a savage moose, not to speak of a panther or a wolf?" "Look here, and I'll show you, old scoffer," replied Step Hen. "Just take note of the carriage that goes into the magazine of my rifle. Do you see how extra long it is, and how the powder chamber swells much larger than the end that holds the bullet? Well, the powder's all in there. But that ain't all, not by a long sight." "Go on," said Giraffe, fretfully, as the other paused dramatically. "Well, this is what you call a soft-nosed bullet. They've tried to prevent the use of them in war because they are so terrible in their results. When it strikes even the flesh of a deer, it mushrooms out till it makes a larger hole than even your big bore. Yes, and if you ask Ellie there, he'd be likely to tell you that if he had to choose between the two, he'd much prefer being hit by a bullet from your old elephant gun to one of my pea shooter, as you call it, that is." Giraffe listened and frowned. He may have tried to look as though he did not believe half he heard, but apparently he had lost considerable interest in his own heavy artillery, for he was seen to quietly lay it down immediately thereafter. "And Sabatis promised to show me how to make what he called a moose call," remarked Bumpus proudly, "being a strip of birch bark, curled in a peculiar way like a long cornucopia, and through this the hunter can coax an old bull to come near enough to give him a shot. Perhaps now he'll even let us hear what it sounds like." "Bully!" exclaimed Davy Jones. "I've always wanted to know what that could be like. What I've read about men calling the moose, does he come to have a fight, Ellie?" "I guess that's just what he does," replied the older guide, who was smoking his pipe contentedly by the fire, all duties for the day having been closed up. "Then that must be why Sabatis stripped the bark from the birch tree after we landed this afternoon," remarked Step Hen. "I wondered whether he meant to write on it, the way you told us the Indians did, Allen, making pictures where the white men would have letters, and drawing the story out. There he goes now, starting to make that horn, I guess." "This is mighty pleasant up here, fellows," said Thad, as he glanced around. "All of you look perfectly happy, as though not a single care rested in your minds." Bumpus immediately shivered, as though that reminded him he ought to be ashamed of himself for enjoying such things, with heartless disregard concerning the dreadful happenings that, for all he knew, were taking place at his home. "Aw," he remarked, with a big sigh. "I wonder where they all are tonight. And I certainly hope from the bottom of my heart my poor father and mother and all my brothers and sisters ain't a-sittin' on the curb without a place to sleep. What if that foolish forgetfulness was the cause of it all? I'll never be happy again, boy, never once." "Oh, there he goes again at that same old racket," exclaimed Giraffe, who did not appear to feel the slightest sympathy for his afflicted comrade, simply because he would not believe there could be any reason for the dire foreboding of Bumpus. "Now, if we had only a wireless outfit along, and Bumpus here could get in direct touch with his folks, I reckon they'll give him the merry laugh because he's been so silly about that old letter. Why, chances are, it wasn't anything much after all. Perhaps your dad wanted to ask his friend the cashier of the bank to drop around that evening, and have a game of billiards at your house. Do please forget it, or anyway bury your troubles deep down in your own bosom, Bumpus, because if you keep a-frettin' and a-moanin' like you've been doing, the chances you'll spoil this outing for the rest of us." "Well," remarked Bumpus indignantly, "guess if you happened to be in the same fix that bothered me, you'd moan and groan too." "Oh, I've got troubles of my own, let me tell you," continued Giraffe. "All of us have. There's Step Hen. He's wondering what we're going to have to eat if we clean out all we fetched along, and the game keeps him shy. Davy's been uneasy this long time, ever since, in fact, he fell into the campfire from the limb of a tree where he was hanging by his toes when the rotten thing broke out under him. Bumpus, you yourself are over your head in seas of trouble, or you were a short time back when you took that header over the end of the canoe into the river. We all have 'em, old fellow, but we don't go around whining and telling everyone. Do close up. There, looks like Sapiens is satisfied with the shape of the horn he's made. Let's take a squint at it, please." The birch bark trumpet was passed around for examination. No one knew better how to manufacture the simple but effective moose call than the Penobscot. Even such an old and experienced guide as the Maine woodsman, Ellie Crookes, was ready to admit that Sapiens stood in a class all by himself when it came to enticing the wary but belligerent moose to approach, by means of insidious call upon the crude horn that breathed defiance one minute and enticing sound the next. "See if you can make it go," suggested Step Hen. Accordingly, Thad, who had it in his hand at the time, placed it to his mouth. He puffed his cheeks out, and Bumpus hastened to clap both hands over his ears, as though he expected to hear a strident blast, such as the old-time Highland chiefs were accustomed to making when they wanted their clan to appear and attack the hated English from south of the border. But it was wonderful what the miserably soft noise followed all those efforts on part of Thad. He had never touched a moose call before, and did not have the knack of extracting anything like a bellow from the innocent-looking device. There was a general laugh at his inability to make use of the call. Even the two main guides joined in, though the result was nothing more nor less than had been expected on their part. It required long practice to just know how to pucker the lips and send the wind whistling through the bark tube that became larger at the further end, until it resembled a megaphone. So Thad turned it over to Step Hen. That worthy did his level best, and was only able to extract a miserable squeak that made Bumpus chuckle. "Just try it yourself and see," said Step Hen, thrusting the call into the chubby hands of the stout scout. And so Bumpus, feeling confident that he could at least excel the last attempt, since he was the bugler of the troop and could play on any sort of instrument, took the call. He grew so red in the face with trying to send forth a clarion note that some of the boys feared he would break a blood vessel. But not even a grunt followed. The horn refused to show any of its good qualities, even when a master hand at the bugle took hold. Then Giraffe was induced to try, with no better success than had attended Step Hen's attempt. "I don't believe the old thing can make a noise at all," declared Bumpus aggressively. Suppose you ask Sabatis to show you, suggested Allen, who might have done it himself fairly well, but did not wish to spoil the work of the Indian. Accordingly, the dark-faced guide, without showing the slightest interest in the matter, took the roll of birch bark and placed it carelessly to his lips. What the boys listened to then was a revelation to them. At first, the sound seemed like several troubled grunts, and Bumpus was grinning with the expectation that this was going to prove to be a rank failure, when the call grew louder and more insistent, until it seemed to roll up against the mountain far away to the other side of the river like a burst of thunder, or in great waves of sound. Then it grew soft again, and finally wound up with another tremendous volume that seemed to make the very air vibrate. After Sabatis took the call down from his lips, the echoes swung back and forth from one side of the river to the other, gradually dying in the farther distance. "My, but that was simply great!" ejaculated the entranced Step Hen. "Never heard anything to equal it in all my life, and such a queer whoop, too," declared Giraffe. "Look at Sabatis. What's he sitting up that way for?" cried Davy Jones. "Seems to be listening, fellers. Oh, I wonder what he's heard. Is that an echo that comes stealing back from up river way?" And Bumpus half started to clamber to his feet. Then the 6 scouts remained motionless as, with their ears on the alert for the faintest sound, they heard an increasing answering call come stealing through the night air. Thad reached out his hand toward where Step Hen had rested the new magazine rifle against a neighboring tree. He guessed instantly what it meant. There was no echo about that thrilling sound. Sabatis had sent out a challenge, and it must have reached the ears of a real bull moose that chanced to be within hearing, and this swelling roar that they were listening to now was his sturdy response. Yes, it was surely a genuine moose that had answered the call, and no doubt he was even at that very minute lumbering along over the pine-covered slope, eager to accept the challenge that breathed in that strange melody of sounds. End of Chapter 7. Recorded by Monty Spanero.
Chapter 8, Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 8, Out for Big Game. "Whew! So that's a moose, is it?" gasped Giraffe, being the first to break the tense silence that had fallen upon the campers. "What a queer old sound," almost whispered Bumpus. "My stars, but I guess he's most as big as our old red barn at home. Is he headed this way, Sabatis, Eli, Jim?" Bumpus cast a despairing look around him while saying this. Thad had an idea he must be trying to pick out a desirable tree, which he could shinny up in case the moose raided the camp. For owing to his build, Bumpus was not so good at climbing as some others, Giraffe or Davy Jones, for instance. "Just now, that's what the old duffer, he's a-doing," replied Eli, while the Indian guide only nodded his head, being a man of few words usually. "Who's going to tackle him?" demanded Step Hen. "Now don't you fellers all look at me just because I said that little rifle of mine was good for any animal that walked these here Maine woods. I gave up first chance to Thad long ago, didn't I, Thad? You see, a feller that hasn't had great experience at such things don't want to rush in too fast. I promised my ma to be careful, and I mean to. As for me, you see, I said that Thad had to try out my new gun. The man in the store told me not to think of standing up before any big game till I'd practiced how to use the pump part. You see, if a feller got rattled and needed to send in a second shot, he might try to work the thing wrong, get it stuck, and then have a fine old time. So Thad for mine." "So say we all of us," remarked Giraffe. "We'd like to see what Thad could do. He hasn't never had a chance at a moose. You go with Sabatis, Thad. The rest of us'll sit by the fire here and wait for things to happen." "No fire," remarked Sabatis. Eli put 'em out. You come along with me, Tad. Somehow the Indian could never get the hang of Thad's name and called him Tad, but it was rather a curiosity to hear him talk at all, so nobody ever objected, least of all the patrol leader. This is mighty fine of you boys, whispered Thad, as he watched Eli and Jim proceeding to scatter the fire and trample on the embers, in which task the other members of the party only too willingly assisted. In a minute, almost, they were in darkness under the pines. Meanwhile, Sabatis had baited the moose with another of his wonderful calls, thrilling the lads just as much as on the first occasion. Ugh, make me shiver, muttered Bumpus. Seems like there just must be a great big critter with horns 10 feet high ready to rush the camp. Hey, don't get away from me, Jim. I want to squat alongside in the dark. After all that light, it seems rough to be left in the gloom. Mustn't talk no more, or sneeze, or cough. Scare moose right bad, whispered the younger guide as he threw an arm across the fat shoulders of Bumpus, for whom he seemed to have taken an especial fancy. And so the balance of the campers crouched there, with every nerve on edge, listening eagerly for the slightest sound, which of course was magnified a dozenfold, owing to the tension under which they were laboring. Meanwhile, Thad had followed after the Indian guide. His very first act before the light of the fire was extinguished had been to hastily examine the small-bore repeating rifle which belonged to Step Hen, and which the owner was so anxious to have Thad christen with the first shot at game worthwhile. It seemed to be in splendid working order, and Thad believed he could depend on it to do the work, provided he aimed straight. There is a vast amount of result depending on the man behind the gun, whether in war or in hunting. At first it seemed pitch dark to the boy, as he kept close at the heels of the Penobscot Indian. That was partly because his eyes had been blinded from sitting there looking into the heart of the blazing campfire so long. Now that this did not happen to be the case any longer, he found that he could gradually see better, until presently the dim form of Sabatis began to make itself noticeable just in front. How silently the Indian moved along, Thad wondered whether this came from the fact of his wearing elkskin moccasins, or because he had been raised never to make a noise when passing through the woods. Perhaps it was both. But Thad wished he could only emulate his example, and then and there he determined to possess himself of the soft-soled hunting boots of the same type as those of Sabatis at the first opportunity. He knew from the confidence with which the guide was advancing through the darkness that he must have immediately settled his mind just where they should lie in wait for the bull moose. And it struck Thad right then and there that the dark-faced guide was about as good a pattern for a Boy Scout to follow as any one of whom he could imagine. Surely Sabatis kept his eyes constantly on the alert and never could be caught napping. For instance, look at the way he lifted his head and listened some 10 minutes before the sheriff arrived upon the scene, and gave the boys that rude jolt when he called out to them to surrender. Sabatis must have heard some slight sound that warned him of a stealthy approach of either human beings or game, and he had crept out of camp so as to be in a position to hold the upper hand in case of any necessity. Perhaps it was a little strange how all these thoughts crowded through the mind of Thad as he was following silently as possible at the very heels of the guide. Other things trooped through that active brain of his, too, for Thad had schooled himself to see and notice everything he could. For instance, he became aware of the fact that they were heading almost directly up into the wind. That in itself was nothing surprising, for a true still hunter always looks to have the air blowing from the game toward himself, as in that way he prevents the keen-scented animal from getting notice of his approach, and fleeing before he can find a chance to send in a shot. Yet the night breeze was coming out of the north, and the moose was approaching from the same quarter. The last time they heard his echoing challenge, it seemed much closer than ever, showing that the bull was advancing with little rushes. He would push on for a couple of minutes, and then halt to send out a call and listen. Then Sabatis would proceed to lure him on with the most seductive calls he could extract from his wonderful birch bark horn. So it went on, the two parties approaching one another at a speed which promised a meeting very shortly. Thad felt his heart beating almost twice as fast as ordinarily. He did not like this, and sternly resolved to control his nerves. The party who expects to shoot big game must be able to aim straight, and keep his wits about him, so as to send in a second and a third shot should they be needed, else he may find that the boot is on the other foot, and that it is he himself who is being hunted. Fighting down this nervousness as best he could, the boy set his teeth firmly together and was resolved to do all in his power to justify the confidence his comrades seemed to have in his ability to do the troop proud, as Giraffe would have said. Another thing he noticed by this time, they did not seem to be trying to get to higher ground at all, as he had expected would be the case. On the contrary, Sabatis was following the upward trend of the river. Perhaps he only wanted to move as far away from the camp as possible, so that the suspicious animal might not get a whiff of air that to him might bear some sign of an extinguished fire, or detect uneasy movements among scouts left behind, and who could not keep just as still as they should. But somehow Thad had an idea there might be yet another reason for their keeping on in this direction, as if meaning to intercept the coming bull moose, and presently he found it out for a fact. Once, twice, 3 times had the guide stopped to send out that strange sound that went reverberating down the river until it died away in mournful cadence in the distance. Then he came to a sudden stop. "Here do, Tad. You drop down this way. Keep eye on top ridge up there. See a moose stand out against sky? Try hit back shoulder. No get, p'raps me shoot too. How that suit?" That was more than Thad had ever heard Sabatis say in one breath since meeting the old town guide. But he instantly saw what the other meant, for Thad had the instincts of a born hunter in him. From the spot where they knelt, by looking up just a little, they could see the bald top of a low-lying ridge close at hand, where it was outlined sharply against the star-jeweled sky. Any bulky object as big as a cow or even a wolf would have, standing there on the ridge, be plainly shown against the heavens. "I understand, Sabatis," the boy whispered back, "and I'll try to do you credit. Tell me when to shoot, that's all." Then the two relapsed into silence. The last defiant call of the coming moose was just dying out. It had been fearfully close, and Thad knew that the animal must be less than a quarter of a mile away from them at the time he stood still to give that call. Sabatis answered it, and Thad began to notice that he no longer sent out that vociferous challenge as before. He believed that the guide must now be imitating the voice of the moose cow, to tempt the other bull on, so as to fight for the possession of a mate, which he doubtless lacked. A few more minutes passed away. Thad imagined he could actually hear his heart pounding away within its prison, so loudly did it throb. He began to fear that after the last challenge the bull had become suspicious, and declined to advance any closer. But apparently the guide did not share in his apprehensions, for he continued to make those lower sounds, as though wheedling the other into coming on, and entering the list with the bull who already had a mate. Still there was no answering blast. What could it mean? Thad was beginning to have a feeling of bitter disappointment and chagrin, when all at once he heard something that gave him an electric shock. It was like crackling of branches or the breaking of dead bushes under the impact of a ponderous body. Thad knew now that the guide had not been mistaken with regard to his ability to coax the suspicious old bull to close quarters, for the moose was even then climbing the other side of the low ridge, and must appear in sight on the summit at any moment. End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 9. Good shot. Great little gun. Strangely enough, Tad discovered at the same time that his nerves had suddenly become as rigid as though he were simply about to fire at a mark to try the new rifle belonging to Step Hen. This is one of the tests of a born hunter. He may feel nervous up to the critical moment, when he stiffens and seems to be made of steel. Tad believed that he was in condition to do himself justice when the proper time came to shoot. The distance was short, and although he would have preferred having a different kind of light than merely seeing a black object lined up against the sky, still he was familiar with guns, and could, if necessary, aim merely through instinct. The floundering grew in volume. Evidently the bull was having some difficulty in pushing upward through the bushes that covered the other side of the little ridge, the existence of which Sabatis must have known before, or he would never have headed this way so confidently. But the animal was certainly coming on, for the sounds grew louder all the while, and whenever he seemed to stop, from any cause, there was always that same tempting, wheedling sound to draw him on again. It was a minute that the scout would never forget, since this was really his first attempt to bring down game of any great size. Again there came a silence. Was the bull hesitating again? Somehow Sebattis had toned down his notes to a low murmur, but it was intended to be very enticing to the stranger. And all at once Thad felt the hand of the guide touch his arm. He guessed that this must be meant as a signal to draw his attention to the fact that there was at last something doing above, and at the same instant the boy detected a moving object come into view over the top of the bald ridge. Higher it rose until he no longer had any doubt that he was looking at the towering horns of a giant moose bull, and in another moment the whole bulk of the beast was outlined against the starry heavens. The critical time was at hand. Sebattis no longer played upon his birch bark horn. He had dropped it to the ground, and doubtless gripped his old rifle so as to be ready to pour in a second shot should his boy companion fail to send his lead where it would strike a death blow. For Sebattis remembered that after all Thad was a lad who had never before looked upon one of these greatest of all American game animals on his native heath, and that perhaps the sight might rattle him. "Shoot!" It was only the faintest of whispers, but Thad caught it, for the mouth of the Indian guide was just a short distance away from his ear. He had already lowered his cheek to the stock of the little rifle, and his finger was touching the trigger. Almost through instinct, such as comes to one who has the blood of a hunter flowing through his veins, the boy judged where he must aim, for such a thing as actually seeing the shoulder of the gloomy figure was just then impossible. The sight of that grand animal standing there with upraised head, listening eagerly for the faintest indication of the presence of those whose calls had tempted him to make this pilgrimage, was one Thad would never be able to wholly get out of his mind. Then he pressed the trigger of his rifle, and its quick response to the invitation came as a pleasure to his ears. Hardly had he fired, than Thad was working the mechanism that was intended to throw out the empty shell and send another fresh cartridge into the firing chamber. And it spoke well for his ability to do the right thing when he accomplished all this without the slightest hitch, so that in 2 seconds he was ready to send in a second shot if needed. Sebattis had not fired. This was really the first thing that flashed into Thad's mind, and gave him sudden hope. The second was that even though he himself had wanted to shoot again, there was no chance, for the moose had disappeared. He expected to hear that crashing of the bushes again, telling how the wounded animal, for he knew he must have hit the moose, was rushing away as fast as he had come, but he failed to catch it. On the contrary, different sounds came to his ear, which he could not understand for the moment. It even seemed to him that the brave moose might have really met with an enemy, and was fighting gallantly against heavy odds. Well, that was just what must be happening, and the foe was one that every moose must sooner or later find himself grappling with, for it was the grim reaper, Death. Sebattis, with that wonderful instinct of his, had known instantly from certain actions of the moose upon being struck that the animal had received his death wound. He understood that there was really no need of his sending in a second shot, and besides, he preferred that the young Nimrod should have the full credit of slaying the big bull. Sebattis, for all he was an Indian, had all the generosity that marks the true sportsman, and later on, in thinking it over, Thad realized how much he was indebted to the guide for refraining from firing after he had done so. "You get 'em, Thad!" exclaimed the Indian, with a touch of pride in his tone. "Oh, do you really think I did, Sebattis?" cried the delighted young hunter, now trembling like an aspen leaf, for the crisis was all past. "Come with me, see," was the reply. Eagerly did Thad climb that little slope. It was now all as silent as death up yonder. He hoped, after all, Sebattis might not be mistaken, and that the wily old moose, although severely hurt, had managed to slip away. They would surely never be able to track him by the drops of blood he shed. But now they were on top of the rise. Thad had brought along with him the little electric torch which he had purchased before starting on this trip to Maine. All he had to do was to grip it in his left hand, press a button, and instantly a brilliant ray of light shot out of the end. With this he could see objects as much as 60 or 80 feet away, and plainly at half that distance. So now he flashed this light ahead. At first he failed to discover anything on the ground, and his heart seemed to rise in his throat with cruel disappointment at the thought that after all he had missed. "Tad, see!" It was the Indian who was plucking at his sleeve and directing his attention over to the left. And as the boy quickly turned the light in that direction, he was thrilled to discover the moose lying there on his side, and not moving in the slightest degree. "Oh, I did get him, didn't I, Sebattis?" he cried, delighted beyond measure at his good fortune, for it is not every hunter who can say he brought down the first big game at which he has fired. The guide was bending over the fallen monarch of the Maine woods. His first inclination was to see where the fatal bullet had struck. "Mighty good shot. Great little gun." He looked at Step Hen's up-to-date .30 caliber rifle as though after this he must be a fool to go packing his own heavy tool through woods and over carries when one half the weight would do better work. And he even thrust his finger into the ragged hole just back of the foreleg of the dead animal, as though wondering how so small a bullet could ever make such a big opening. Sebattis had something to learn concerning the results springing from the use of a soft-nosed bullet that flattens out when striking any object, even the side of an animal. "We ought to let the boys know right away," said Thad, thinking of how his chums must be almost consumed with anxiety to be told the result of that lone shot, which Step Hen must guess came from his new rifle, and not the larger one carried by the Indian guide. "Thad, call 'em here. Me make little fire, so see how climb hill," said Sebattis. Only too gladly did Thad send out a whoop that easily reached the listening ears of those comrades in camp, and answering hail came back. "Did you get him, Thad?" "Come on over here, all of you," was all Thad would say in return. Immediately they heard a great threshing as the entire crowd started on a run in the direction of the call. Doubtless poor Bumpus would have fared badly, and been left far in the lurch only for the kindness of Jim, who gave him a helping hand over all obstacles. Meanwhile the Indian had hastened to scrape together a few handfuls of dead stuff, which he seemed to know just where to look for. To this he applied a match, and as it sprang into a tiny flame, he proceeded to add such fuel as he could most readily pick up. In less than a minute he had a real fire going, that began to dispel the shadows of night around the vicinity of the spot where the giant moose lay. As it burned on the top of the bald ridge, the fire would serve as a beacon to show the others just how to reach the place. Now they were climbing the low elevation. Thad could hear some of them puffing at a great rate. Of course, Giraffe was the first to arrive, with Eli close on his heels, then Allen, and the others trailing after in any old style. Each one of them pushed immediately to where the prize lay, and loud were the exclamations of astonishment when they realized just what a monster it was that Thad had brought down with that one fortunate shot. Step Hen in particular was almost crazy with joy. "Now make fun of my pea shooter, will you, Giraffe?" he cried, dancing around, and hugging his fine little rifle with all the delight a boy might show in the possession of his first long trousers. "Just look at what it did, would you? Why, anybody's just silly to lug an old heavy blunderbuss like yours around, when he can own such a bully little thing as this. Oh, didn't she just do everything to that old bull, though? If he had known about my gun, he'd have lit out in the other direction, lickety-split. After this, why should I be afraid to stand up in front of any sort of big game that walks on 4 feet or hoofs? You hear me, Giraffe?" Thad did not disturb the wild dream of the tenderfoot chum, though he wondered whether Step Hen could have hit Bumpus's old red barn if, lying there in wait, he had suddenly seen the monster rise into view above the crown of the low ridge, and felt Sebattis nudge him in the ribs as a warning that the time had come to shoot. But it was a great moment for all the scouts, as they stood over the prize that had fallen to the gun of their patrol leader, Thad Brewster. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson.